In the last episode, we established that an inner order of the Jesuits has carried a secret since the founding of their society in the 16th century. The secret was that the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity, arrives in the world in human form in the body of a woman in every generation. We also established that the Jesuits do not simply carry that secret, they act on it. They watch for the woman who carries the Holy Spirit in each age, they monitor her, and they assess what she represents to the institution they have spent centuries protecting. And in the early 20th century, the woman they were watching was a Russian mystic named Helena Roerich. To understand why Helena matters to this story, why the Jesuits watched her, and why Louis Buff-Perry was trying to trace her footsteps, and why I believe she was the incarnation of the Holy Spirit in her generation, we need to understand who she was and what she received in Paris in 1923, and what the tradition she was embedded into understood about the role she had been given. Helena Roerich was born in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1879 into a cultured and aristocratic family with deep roots in Russian intellectual and artistic circles. From her earliest years, she demonstrated gifts that went beyond the ordinary. Helena had a sensitivity to spiritual experience, a capacity for vision and inner perception, and an intellectual appetite that she pursued across philosophy, theology, ancient languages, and the mystical traditions of both the East and West. She married Nicholas Roerich, who would become one of the most celebrated painters of the 20th century, a man whose work drew on the landscapes of Central Asia, the Himalayas, and the deep spiritual traditions of the cultures he encountered across decades of travel and study. Together, Helena and Nicholas founded a spiritual path they called Agni Yoga, or the Yoga of Fire. In the traditions of the East, fire is not simply a physical phenomena. It is the highest spiritual energy, the force that bridges the material and cosmic worlds, the visible and the invisible, the human and the divine. Agni, the Sanskrit word for fire, names the sacred flame that burns at the heart of creation, the same flame that the tongues of fire at Pentecost represented, the same flame that lights the menorah, and the same flame that Zoroastrian temples have kept burning for thousands of years as a symbol of divine presence that never goes out. For Helena, fire was not a metaphor. It was the substance of the spiritual life she was living and the teachings she spent most of her adult life recording and transmitting. Helena was, by any measure, a woman of extraordinary stature. She corresponded with heads of state, philosophers, artists, and spiritual teachers across several continents, and she authored multiple volumes of teachings that are still studied today in Agni Yoga communities around the world. She has been described by those who knew her in terms that went beyond admiration into something closer to reverence, not the reverence given to a teacher or a public figure, but the reverence given to someone in whose presence the ordinary boundaries between the human and the divine seemed thinner than usual. And then while she and her family were living in Paris, France, in October 1923, she received a package that would change everything. The package arrived without a clear sender. Inside it was a small fragment of a dark, ancient, and dense stone that the Roerichs identified as a meteorite. Along with it was a note that read simply, "At the request of M.M." Those two initials have never been identified. Some who study the Roerichs believe they stand for Master Moria, a figure in the theosophical tradition understood as one of the great spiritual teachers who guides humanity's evolution from a level of existence beyond the ordinary. He was also Helena's guide and teacher. Others have speculated that they stand for Master Mason or for Mary Magdalene, weaving the stone's arrival into the broader mystery of hidden traditions and secret lineages that run through so much of this history. I find it difficult to resist the possibility that MM stands for Magna Mater, the Great Mother, the ancient goddess Sibyl, who was venerated across the ancient world as a powerful divine feminine presence, and who is said to have carried a sacred black meteorite stone, a relic believed to hold divine energy. If that reading is correct, then whomever sent the stone was not simply delivering a sacred object. They were invoking an older tradition and sending a coded message to a woman they understood as the latest carrier of a presence that had been moving through human history since long before the Christian era. Helena and her husband Nicholas called the stone Cintamani, a name drawn from Buddhist and Hindu tradition meaning wish-fulfilling jewel, a sacred object of cosmic origin, believed to carry within it a substance capable of preserving communication between the earthly and the divine. In Western tradition, the same stone has been called the Holy Grail. Wolfram von Eschenbach, in his medieval poem Parsifal, described the Grail not as a cup, but as a stone, the lapis exilis, the wandering or exiled stone that moves through the world in the hands of those appointed to carry it, never resting in one place for long, always in motion, always in the possession of someone whose identity is known only to the tradition that appoint them. Helena wrote of the stone in terms that makes its significance impossible to miss. She described it as a significant teraphim of the brotherhood, a fragment of something sent from the far-off worlds, permeated with a substance that helps preserve vibrational communications with those worlds. For her, it was not a relic or a talisman in the popular sense of those words. It was a living connection, a point of contact between the human and the divine, between the carrier and the source of what she carried. To understand what Helena's reception of the stone meant within the tradition she was part of, we need to understand the holy woman Rachel, the wife of Jacob, who took the teraphim, the sacred relics of divine authority, from her father Laban, as she and Jacob departed for a new land. Rachel's possession of those relics was not theft in the ordinary sense. It was the claiming of an authority that belonged to her, the authority of the carrier, the one in whose hands the sacred object confirmed and expressed a divine mandate that no institution had the power to grant or revoke. Jacob, her husband, had anointed another stone that he had used as a pillow, a stone he named Bethel, or the house of God, pouring oil over it and declaring it sacred, giving it the status of standing in for the presence of the divine in the material world. This anointed Bethel stone carries significance across multiple traditions. More importantly, it introduces a recurring religious idea that the divine presence does not permanently withdraw from the world, but remains embodied in a chosen vessel. While some traditions express this through a sacred stone, others express it through a living person. In the Sufi understanding of Islam, there exists a figure known as a Badal, a chosen person whose identity is known only to God, through whom the continuity of the world is maintained, and when one dies, another is secretly appointed to take their place. The carrier is never without a successor, the tradition never goes dark, the presence never fully withdraws from the world. This is the tradition Helena was embedded in. As the carrier of the Cintamani stone, she was a Badal, the anointed intermediary of her generation, standing in place of the comforter until the next arrival, maintaining the vibrational connection between the human and the divine that the stone represented. Louis Buff Perry, in his paper, Rachel Raised Again, traces this lineage with considerable care, connecting the Bethel stone, the teraphim, the Cintamani, and the Holy Grail as different names for the same sacred object carried through history. He arrives through his own scholarly rigor at Helena's door, and then, for reasons I will come to shortly, he turns away. What Perry does not turn away from is the evidence of Jesuit interest in Helena. His paper documents, drawing on Helena's own diary entries and the records of the Roerich Circle, that the inner order of the Jesuits were monitoring her, and with full awareness of what she was carrying and what it meant. Helena recorded in her diary in August 1923, months before the stone arrived in October that year, that the Jesuits were looking to monitor the stone, and that secrecy was therefore necessary. The significance of that timing cannot be overstated. She was writing about the surveillance of a stone she had not yet received, which means that whoever was communicating with her spiritually had told her in advance both that the stone was coming and that the Jesuits already knew. The inner order was not reacting to Helena. They were anticipating her. It is little wonder that, after the Roerichs established their museum in New York on Riverside Drive in Manhattan in the 1920s, within the building now known as the Master Apartments, organizations connected to the Vatican would later establish a presence in the immediate vicinity. One was the West Side Jesuit Center, which located nearby. Another was Opus Dei, the conservative and highly secretive Catholic organization that established its New York prelature directly next door to the master apartments on Riverside Drive. Opus Dei has been described by the Belgian government as a cult, and in 2022, Pope Francis decreed that its head could no longer be appointed a bishop. The Roerich's former building may still contain a fragment of the Cintamani stone in its foundational cornerstone, placed there by the Roerichs in 1929. It is now surrounded on multiple sides by organizations whose loyalties run to Rome, whether that is coincidence or whether they have placed themselves there to see if the next incarnation of the Holy Spirit will venture there. I will leave for you to decide. I want to add something about Louis Buff Perry here, because his role in this story is genuinely complicated, and the complication matters. He is a man of extraordinary intellectual gift. His work spans decades, crosses multiple disciplines, and has contributed to fields ranging from national security to ancient linguistics to theological history. His paper, Rachel Raised Again, is a serious piece of scholarship that comes closer to the truth of Helena Roerich's significance than almost anything else written outside of the Agni Yoga tradition itself. He traces the lineage of the sacred stone from Rachel through Jacob, through the Knights Templar, through the Roerichs, with a rigor that is genuinely impressive. He identifies the Badal tradition and understands its significance. He documents the Jesuits' surveillance of Helena with care and precision. And then, having done all of that, he calls Helena and Nicholas Roerich mythmakers and embellishers, dismisses their spiritual claims as romantic elaboration of ancient legends, and ultimately refuses to grant Helena the recognition that his own research demands. He quotes her writing extensively, draws on her insights to support his arguments, and simultaneously undermines her authority as a spiritual figure. The contradiction sits at the center of his work, and he never resolves it. I have thought about why he chose to do that for a long time, and I believe the answer is this. Perry's entire intellectual and spiritual formation was Jesuit. He loves the Jesuits, as he said in his own email to me. The altar boy in him will always love them. And for a man formed in that tradition, with that loyalty running through his scholarship, the conclusion that his research is pointing toward, that the Holy Spirit incarnate in the 20th century was a woman, a Russian mystic, operating entirely outside the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, confirmed not by any institutional sanction, but by the stone in her possession and the tradition that sent it to her, is a conclusion that his framework will not allow him to reach. There is also a moment in his documentary that is very curious. Perry is at the master apartment speaking with a historian about what was placed inside the Rajput casket that may still be embedded in the master building's foundation in New York. And in this moment, the initials E.I. appear on a document connected to the stone's history. Perry cannot identify them. E.I. are the initials of Elena Ivanova, Helena Roerich's own Russian name. The man who had spent years following her trail, who had documented her surveillance by the Jesuits, who had traced the lineage of the sacred stone to her door, could not recognize her initials when they were placed in front of him. I do not think that was a failure of memory. I think it clarifies his role in this whole affair. But then again, I leave this assessment to you also. I believe that Helena Roerich was imbued with the Holy Spirit in her lifetime. She carried what had been carried before her by Mary, by Guglielmo of Milan, by Rachel, by Isis, by the Shekinah, and by the goddess Sophia. The same presence, the same divine feminine force, arriving again in a new body, in a new century, continuing the work that the previous carrier had left unfinished, maintaining the connection between the human world and the divine source that the tradition of the stone represents. Helena knew what she was carrying, and she knew who was watching her. She knew that the inner order of the Jesuits, the keepers of Loyola's secret, understood her significance and were determined to ensure that it never became a problem for the institution they served. She wrote about this with a directness that leaves no room for ambiguity. She was not paranoid. She was informed. And the institutional presence that surrounds the master building on Riverside Drive today suggests that the watching has never fully stopped. The question that the next part of this series needs to address is what happens next. If the Holy Spirit returns in every generation, then Helena was not the last carrier, and the tradition does not end with her. As we are fully aware, the institution that monitored her in the 20th century is still active in the 21st century and is still carrying the inner order secret and watching. The Jesuit Pope Francis, who recently passed away, was replaced by another man who signed a document in November 2025, taking away any claim Mother Mary may have had to a more authoritative role in the Church, telling us exactly what the institution has decided to do about this truth it has been carrying for hundreds of years. The battle to keep the divine feminine nature of the Holy Spirit suppressed in this century has begun again, and the Jesuits are undoubtedly looking for her again. Thank you for listening. My name is Lori Paris, and welcome to She Life.
Padre nuestro que estás en el cielo, santificado sea tu nombre. Venga tu reino, hágase tu